When I think about Scorpio, I think about deep water and intense feeling. It's persistent emotion, strategic focus, loyalty to the truth, and the willingness to face endings when they come. In this video, we're going to explore how Scorpio energy can be matched by our tarot decks, so you can recognize it and work with it in your readings. I will be sharing 8 decks that align with different facets of this intense zodiac sign, and we'll look for determination, depth, and drive in each of them. To keep this practical, I am breaking the sign down into a few key parts. The qualities that give Scorpio its emotional style, the planets that govern how it behaves, the archetype that best describes it, and the tarot cards that are linked to Scorpio. First up, let's take a look at how the sign of Scorpio is described by its element and modality. Scorpio is a fixed water sign, and the deck I've chosen to represent this is the Labanco Tarot. Fixed signs governing the middle portion of their season embody stable and persistent energy. So they are enduring, they're dedicated, they have a sense of stability and purpose. I always think of Scorpio as deep water. Although there is flow and movement within it, the presence and intensity of the depths are what grant it that sense of stability. Or I guess presence might be a better word. It's not a flighty sign, and deep water can't be easily emptied. The sense of depth and stability also translates to the focused, strategic nature that Scorpio has. Scorpios are perceptive, they're strong-willed, and they are willing to play the long game. There is a patience and persistence there, which is another side of that fixed nature. And as a water sign, water is related to emotions, and Scorpio has a bit of a reputation as obsessive and possessive in their relationships with others. This is not always going to be true, of course, but power struggles are a theme that is highlighted in this sign. And so the deck I've chosen, the Labanco Tarot, is one that feels deep and intense. I know that when I've spoken about this deck before, I've spoken about it as something that I need to spend a lot of time with. Very fitting that the King of Cups pops up here. The King of Cups is often associated with Scorpio, and here he is kind of like underwater, so that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, this is a deck that I need to sit with, spend a lot of time with. I need quite a lot of patience to work with this deck, and that's not a bad thing. I like spending a lot of time with my decks, and this is a deck that wants some dedication. Just a note, this is the out-of-print indie edition of this deck, but there is a new mass market printing that has recently come out. So if you've been eyeing this deck, you can now get it much more easily. And I would highly recommend it because it is a gorgeous deck. The artwork is beautiful, perfect for Scorpio season. So that is the Labanco Tarot as my fixed water deck. All right, next up, I want to talk about Scorpio's planetary rulers. Scorpio actually has 2 planetary rulers. It's one of a couple of signs that shares this. So in Hellenistic and classical astrology, Scorpio is ruled by Mars. And in modern astrology, which includes the outer planets, Scorpio is ruled or co-ruled by Pluto. So my pick for a deck that embodies a Martian rulership of Scorpio is the Mary L. Tarot. Mars lends an assertion to Scorpio. It is what helps make it such a persistent sign, also quite defensive sometimes. So Mars is the warrior planet. It's all about action and energy and drive, and it lends Scorpio the strategic will and capability needed to achieve its goals. And I think Mars also lends persistence to Scorpio, which blends nicely alongside its fixed modality because it's fixed, it's in the middle of its season, it is very entrenched in what it's doing. It's persistent. And the reason that I chose the Mary L to embody this is partly because Mary L feels like quite a fiery deck. And so with that Mars rulership, Mars being a very fiery planet, even though Scorpio is a water sign, that just made sense to me. Also, I'm now just realizing that the 2 colors I associate most with this deck are this kind of blue, which could be considered like very watery, and then this bright red, which is very like fiery. So it actually makes a lot of sense to have that like fire water blend embodied by this deck a little bit. But the other reason I chose this as a Scorpio deck more generally is because it's so intense. There we have the Ten of Swords with this like Grim Reaper type figure popping up. This is such an intense deck. Similarly to the Labanco, when I work with this deck, it needs a lot of time. It's not easy breezy. I can't just pull cards and go. If I really want to get the most from the Marielle Tarot, I need to sit with it. I need to really think. I need to really kind of puzzle it out almost, kind of figure out what it's telling me and come to my conclusions in quite a winding sort of a way. So that is the Marielle Tarot as my pick for the Mars rulership of Scorpio. To match up with Pluto as ruler of Scorpio, I have chosen the Wild Unknown Alchemy deck. So while Mars was about action and drive and assertion, Pluto is about transformation and death and power. It aligns much more closely with the Scorpio stereotype of like sex and death and power. And Pluto's rulership really emphasizes the psychological depth of Scorpio. And so the reason I have chosen this, the Wild Unknown Alchemy deck, to match up with this aspect of Scorpio is because of that transformation aspect. And I thought, what better to symbolize the transformation of Scorpio than this like alchemy and the alchemical process and the act of literally transforming one thing into another. I will be really honest, I have not worked with this deck yet. This is my personal pick for Scorpio season for my like personal card a day practice. So I will be working with this, but this is actually very new to my collection. This was a birthday gift, and I haven't had time to touch it yet. But based on vibes alone, this feels like the right kind of pick for Pluto's rulership of Scorpio. I also, spoiler alert, there's another Kim Cran's deck in this video. It just makes sense for Scorpio. Like, it's so intense. Here we go. Pluto. Pluto pops up here just as I'm talking about it. So it just makes sense. That idea of transforming something into something else. And I think there's also a kind of, I don't know if this deck really talks about decay, but that idea of transformation is always like hand in hand with the idea of decay for me. Weird as that might sound. So again, it kind of makes sense with like decay and transformation and Pluto and death and Scorpio. It's all tied up together, and I think this deck is a pretty good representation of that. So that is the Kim Cran's Wild Unknown Alchemy deck as my Pluto rulership of Scorpio match. All right, moving on to the archetype that I have chosen to represent Scorpio. I've gone with the archetype of the detective or the investigator. And my deck pick for this is actually the Bonefire Tarot. So this might not seem like an obvious choice, but trust me, I'll explain. So the detective or the investigator is somebody who is driven to uncover what has been concealed. And what makes this archetype feel right to me for Scorpio is that a detective can become so obsessive about what they're investigating. They really interrogate small details and suspect everyone. I think there's a kind of paranoid detective archetype that also kind of fits for Scorpio. You know, a detective is somebody who can really isolate themselves in their search for the truth of a situation. And that feels quite Scorpionic, you know, it's intense, it's deep, it's intense, it's a little bit obsessive. It kind of makes sense. But there's also this idea of like following a hunch with, you know, in any kind of like detective story, or when you've got like a detective or an investigator figure, they're following their hunches, they're following their instincts. You see that crop up a lot, and I think that fits really well with the intuition of the water signs, which of course Scorpio is. And so the Bonefire, I picked this deck because it is full of symbols that mean specific things, and you can kind of trace that through the cards. You can sort of follow the trail of the symbols, and that feels quite like detective-y, like following clues. And it's also a deck for like really zooming in on details, which I think fits that kind of like obsessive, detail-oriented thing. It's also actually, you can kind of see as I've got it laid out here, this is a deck that's really easy it's really easy to get overwhelmed when you're looking at multiple cards all at once. It really wants you to kind of focus and hone in. And that also feels like it fits Scorpio really well. So that is the Bonefire Tarot as my detective archetype deck for Scorpio. Moving now to talk about the tarot cards that are associated with Scorpio in some way. First up, the Major Arcana card that is corresponded to the sign is the Death card, the 13th card in the Major Arcana. It's maybe a little heavy-handed, but it does make sense for the sign of death and transformation. And my pick for this is the Circle of Doors Tarot. Both Scorpio and the Death card embody a cycle of constant change, and they literally confront the most painful moment of that cycle. A lot of people will soften the Death card in some way, make it a little bit less heavy and intense. Here is the Death card, just as I'm speaking about it. They'll call it something like rebirth or renewal. And personally, I always think that you have to have the death moment in order to have the later rebirth. And so the Death card should be what it is. It should kind of face up to it. I also think there is an element of the Scorpio mystery here, because despite what I just said, the Death card is like rarely, if ever, about actual death. It's an ending of some kind. It's an unavoidable change. It might be painful. There are things to grieve. You're losing something in some way, but it doesn't need to be interpreted so literally as like the Grim Reaper, somebody's going to die. Like, that's a bit too on the nose. The Death card is blunt, but it's not necessarily literal. And I went with the Circle of Doors Tarot here because it has that visual depth and darkness. Like, it's a black and white deck. It's very moody. And I think the idea of transformation is suggested really nicely by the multiple exposure photography style that's going on. Like, we've got different images laid over each other, and I think that visualizes this idea of transformation and change really nicely. As a deck, this is also just really intense. And it feels like the finality of the Death card in that way. It can be really intense, it can be really blunt. That is quite the running theme for this video, like I said, about the Labanco, the Mary L. Scorpio is intense, Scorpio is deep and dark, and this deck is no different. So this is the Circle of Doors as my Death card Scorpio pick. And now we move to the Minor Arcana cards. So the Minor Arcana cards associated with Scorpio are the 5, 6, and 7 of Cups, because Scorpio is a water sign, it's in the cup suit, and the 5, 6, and 7 are associated with the 3 decans of Scorpio. So first up, we have 5 of Cups, which is ruled by the planet Mars, and my deck pick for this is the Wild Unknown Tarot. I told you there would be another Kim Kranz deck, and here it is. So in Scorpio, Mars is strategic, and because Scorpio is so mysterious and secretive, Mars does a lot of its battles in secret. So although as the ruler of Scorpio, it's really strongly placed in this sign, it's really powerful in Scorpio, it's not as loud or brash as in a sign like Aries, which it does also rule. And the 5 of Cups card, which is here actually, the 5 of Cups card is a card of intense grief, which honestly kind of feels right for Scorpio. And the 5 of Cups, though, is also about the transformation that comes from loss. And Mars gives the resilience and persistence to work through the moment with emotional strength. And I think there's also something to be said for the 5 of Cups being a card of extremes. Like, it's a really intense grief and mourning. It's when you're like really in the moment, in the depth of the feeling. And obviously Mars is an intense planet in a sign that can be a little bit obsessive. So I think it is really highlighting that theme of extremes. And the reason I chose the Wild Unknown for this is because this deck's a little bit spiky. I think there is an intensity to this deck in the black and white in particular. And there is something, like, especially when I pull out cards like this, there is kind of like a melancholy to this deck, maybe. Here we've got a 10 of Swords, looking really dramatic. The 8 of Cups here. There's an isolation to this deck, and I can't remember when I talked about isolation in relation to Scorpio already, but there is an isolation or kind of a solitary feeling to this deck. It's not peoply. There's animals in a lot of the cards. There's a really good depiction of like that decay that I was talking about earlier. It's not a kind of community oriented or relationship oriented deck. And so it feels very right for that 5 of Cups moment where you're kind of, it's just you and your feelings. You're kind of on your own with it all. So yeah, that is the Wild Unknown for my 5 of Cups Mars and Scorpio deck. Yeah, there's a harshness to it, even in the colourful cards, because I think of all that black and white line work. It's quite stark and intense, and that feels like Mars in Scorpio. So there we go, the Wild Unknown. All right, the 6 of Cups is ruled by the Sun, and my deck choice for this is the Dream Vision Tarot. So the Sun in Scorpio, the Sun ruling this second decan of Scorpio. The Sun illuminates everything, that's what it does. And Scorpio is a shadowy sign. So this is an interesting combination, which I think is also reflected in like there's a strangeness to the 6 of Cups imagery, the Rider-Waite-Smith. I'll pop it up on the screen. And I know there's been a lot written about the 6 of Cups imagery, but like the smaller child figure is kind of dressed as an old woman, and there's like a weird exchange happening. I think, was it Rachel Pollack who went into this in one of her books, maybe? The 6 of Cups is a little bit odd, and I think when you're putting that in the perspective, or you're putting that in the context of the Sun and Scorpio together, that maybe makes a little bit more sense. This card is often associated with nostalgia, which makes sense when you consider the astrology, the Sun kind of adding that happiness, that golden glow to the deep emotional terrain of Scorpio. Sun in Scorpio finds value in remembering the past, but it can definitely trip into like over romanticizing and rose tinted glasses, sunny filter view of the past. And so my pick, the Dream Vision, maybe feels a little bit odd. It kind of did to me, even though it's a very like watery looking deck, so it also makes sense. This is a little bit lighter than the usual Scorpio energy, I say as I pulled the 3 of Swords, but like this is, a lot of the decks I've pulled out have been quite like either visually dark or just very arresting and intense, and this doesn't have that same tone to it, but it's still quite mysterious. I mean, even like they look kind of like alien figures, like it's not super realistic. It's not very relatable as imagery. It's very clearly stylized. So it still has that like Scorpio mystique, but I think this is a little bit softer, a little bit gentler. It's Scorpio's mystery and edginess filtered through the way the Sun perceives everything and kind of adds a little bit of like brightness to everything. I don't think this necessarily captures the 6 of Cups card quite so much. Like, I wouldn't say this feels very nostalgic or like remembering, like harking back to previous emotional times or anything, but it definitely does feel quite Sun in Scorpio with the way that I've described them here. So that is the Dream Vision Tarot deck. And then finally, we have the 7 of Cups, the last decan of Scorpio, which is ruled by Venus. And my deck pick for Venus and Scorpio is the Tarot of Vampires. So the planet Venus is traditionally in its detriment when it's in Scorpio, which just means that Scorpio is not where Venus does its best work. It's not where Venus is most comfortable or expresses itself best. We've got the planet of love and pleasure and ease and abundance kind of swimming in very deep, shadowy waters. And Scorpio, unsurprisingly, lends an intensity to Venus. So that usual like harmony is kind of tipped more into dramatic, sexy, obsessive love affairs. And there isn't that sense of ease that is usually associated with Venus. Venus usually brings gifts, but the Seven of Cups imagery is more like dreams and delusions. Especially in the Rider-Waite-Smith, we see our shadowy figure contemplating 7 different cups. It's all shrouded in mystery, so it adds a little bit of edge to that, like I said, sense of ease and the gifts that Venus usually brings with it. With the transformative nature of Scorpio, Venus could look like a belief that the power of love can overcome all else. Venus in Scorpio is driven by the desire for profound connection rather than like self-preservation with a more kind of Martian energy. Venus in Scorpio can maybe be when you're like drowning in somebody else, maybe. And so the Tarot of Vampires, ultimately I chose this deck because it's kind of sexy. That's really it. It's a really Scorpio deck. It's really dramatic. It's sexy. Like, here we go. But I chose this deck because it's dark and dramatic and sexy. But also there is a sense of transformation and death, in the sense that vampires are literally an undead creature who have been transformed after death. Like, it really does hit on that theme of Scorpio. And of course, there's a lot of mystery and fantasy here because it's otherworldly. It's about a magical race, which is, again, very, very Seven of Cups. There's a lot of mystery and fantasy. And I also just couldn't talk about Scorpio without talking about the Tarot of Vampires. It is, to my mind, it's such a Scorpio deck. It's sex and death in a deck. The guidebook for this deck actually is a really good example of the kind of almost the detective archetype that I was talking about, because this guidebook is so in depth. This guidebook is filled with so much knowledge and information. It's like nearly 300 pages about this deck, about the world of this deck, about the different, like here for each card, we've got essence, message, and quality, shadow side. We've got Kabbalah, we've got alchemy as mentioned in here. Like, it's the perfect deck for Scorpio. What else can I say? So there we have it. That is 8 decks mapped onto Scorpio energy. This video is part of an ongoing series where I match decks to each sign. The playlist is in the description if you want to check it out, and Fiery Sagittarius will be next. So stay tuned for that. Subscribe if you haven't already. If you want to see more deck choices for this time of year, then check out my autumn decks video. And if you want to see some more deep and dramatic decks that I have in my collection, I have a video about that too. They will both be linked in the description. For more tarot and astrology together, including a whole tarot lab module with resources and experiments, you can join me over on Patreon. I'd love to know which decks feel most like Scorpio to you, whether they're decks I've talked about today, whether there are decks that you think I missed out. Let me know in the comments your favorite Scorpio decks, and also how Scorpio energy feels to you in a reading. But that's it from me. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for spending some time with me here today. Give me a like if you liked it, subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you in the next one. Bye bye.